I was the man she walked away from because I couldn't afford her dreams. She said love doesn't pay the bills, and I believed her. What she never knew was that the night she left, something inside me hardened into purpose. Years later, when our paths crossed again, the truth I carried was heavier than any apology she could offer. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about dignity, timing, and the quiet way life balances its scales. Part 1. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, if someone measured your worth by what you had instead of who you were, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. Your stories deserve to be heard too. My name is Daniel, and for a long time, I was the kind of man people looked through instead of at. I wasn't lazy and I wasn't careless. I worked hard, sometimes 2 jobs at once, but no matter how many hours I stacked together, the money never seemed to stay. It slipped through my fingers like water, always going toward rent, groceries, bus fare, and the small emergencies that seemed to follow poor people like shadows. I learned early that poverty isn't just about not having money, it's about constantly explaining yourself, constantly apologizing for circumstances you didn't choose. Renata came into my life when I was 26. I remember the exact moment because it felt like the world leaned in a little closer. She was standing in line at a small coffee shop near my second job, wearing a soft gray sweater and holding a book she wasn't reading. When our eyes met, she smiled like she already knew me. That smile made me feel visible in a way I hadn't felt in years. We talked about nothing important at first: the weather, the long line, how bad the coffee smelled for how expensive it was. But even then, there was a rhythm between us, like 2 people who somehow spoke the same emotional language. Renata was ambitious. She talked about travel, about owning a home with large windows, about never having to check prices before ordering food. I listened, nodding, storing her dreams carefully inside me. I didn't interrupt her with reality. I didn't say that my bank account barely survived each month. I didn't say that sometimes I skipped meals so I could pay my student loan minimum. I wanted to be the man who could stand beside her dreams without shrinking. For a while, love made everything feel possible. We walked everywhere because gas was expensive, and she said she liked it that way. We cooked simple meals together, laughing when something burned, pretending it was intentional. When she slept next to me in my small apartment, the cracked ceiling above us felt less like a flaw and more like proof that we were building something from the ground up. I told myself that love was enough, that time would take care of the rest. But time has a way of revealing the cracks you try to plaster over with hope. Renata started noticing things she hadn't before: the way I hesitated before paying, the way I avoided conversations about the future, the way I stiffened when she talked about weddings and houses and children. She never yelled. That almost made it worse. Her disappointment came quietly, settling into the room like a fog. The first time she said it out loud, we were sitting at a bus stop. She stared straight ahead and said, "Daniel, I don't want to struggle forever." Her voice wasn't cruel, it was tired. I wanted to reach for her hand, to promise her everything would change, but promises felt irresponsible when I didn't know how to keep them. So I stayed quiet, and that silence planted something between us that never stopped growing. I tried harder after that. I took night classes online, teaching myself skills I hoped would lead to better work. I slept less, I pushed my body past its limits. But progress is slow when you start with nothing, and Renata's patience was thinner than my optimism. She began comparing me to others, not directly at first, but through stories. A friend whose boyfriend just got promoted, a cousin who bought a new car. Each example felt like a small cut, precise and unintentional, but painful all the same. The night she left is burned into me with painful clarity. She stood by the door, her coat already on, her bag packed. I remember thinking how neat and composed she looked, like she had rehearsed this moment. She told me she loved me, and I believed her. Then she said love wasn't enough. She said she needed security, a future she could see, not just feel. I didn't beg. Pride can be a strange companion when you have nothing left. I just nodded, swallowing the words that rose up like panic. When the door closed behind me, the apartment felt enormous and empty. I sat on the floor for a long time, my back against the couch, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. That night, something inside me broke, but something else hardened. I realized that poverty had taken more from me than comfort. It had taken the woman I loved. And for the first time, I allowed myself to feel angry. After that first small opportunity, my life didn't suddenly become easier. In many ways, it became harder. When you're trying to climb out of nothing, every step feels steep, and every mistake feels expensive. I still lived in the same apartment, still rode the same bus, still counted coins at the grocery store. The difference was internal. I woke up each morning with a quiet sense of direction, like I was finally walking toward something instead of just away from failure. The startup I joined was run by 3 people who believed more in effort than credentials. They didn't care where I came from or what my bank balance looked like. They cared that I stayed late, asked questions, and didn't quit when things broke. And things broke often. Our first product failed so badly that we couldn't even give it away. I remember sitting in a cramped office, staring at a whiteboard filled with crossed-out ideas, thinking how familiar disappointment felt. It reminded me too much of the look on Renata's face in those final months. There were nights I almost gave up, nights when exhaustion pressed so hard on my chest that breathing felt like work. I would lie awake thinking about how easy it would be to accept that some people are just meant to struggle forever. But then I would remember the bus stop conversation, her words about not wanting to struggle, and something stubborn would rise in me. Not anger toward her anymore, but a refusal to let that be the end of my story. I stopped checking her social media, but news still reached me through mutual friends. Renata was doing well. She had moved into a nicer place. She was dating someone who worked in finance, someone who took her on trips and posted pictures of expensive dinners. Each update stung in a dull, distant way. Not because I wanted her back, but because it confirmed the quiet fear I carried that she had been right, that love without money really wasn't enough. Time passed in long stretches of routine. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. Our second product gained traction. A few clients turned into many. Investors started asking questions. I learned the language of meetings, of negotiations, of confidence. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't panic when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I started paying bills early. I bought groceries without doing math in my head. The day I moved out of that old apartment, I stood in the empty living room for a long moment. The walls were still scuffed, the ceiling still cracked, but it no longer felt like a symbol of failure. It felt like proof. Proof that I had survived a version of myself I would never forget. I didn't tell anyone how emotional that moment was. Some victories are too personal to explain. With financial stability came a strange kind of loneliness. People treated me differently now. Colleagues listened when I spoke. Strangers assumed competence. I was no longer invisible, but I was also more guarded. Love, once freely given, now felt like something that needed careful handling. I dated occasionally, but I kept a part of myself reserved, unsure of how to trust motivations again. Years passed like that, work filling most of my days, reflection filling most of my nights. The startup grew beyond anything we imagined. Eventually, it was acquired. The numbers attached to my name didn't feel real at first. I remember refreshing my banking app over and over, convinced there had been a mistake. I thought of my younger self, counting coins, skipping meals, believing survival was the same thing as living. If I could have spoken to him, I would have told him to hold on just a little longer. I didn't change overnight. I didn't buy flashy cars or post pictures of luxury. Wealth, to me, felt fragile, like something that could vanish if I wasn't careful. I invested quietly, lived comfortably, and helped my parents in ways they never asked for. The real change was internal. I no longer felt small. I no longer felt like I had to explain my existence. It was at a charity event of all places that our paths crossed again. I almost didn't recognize Renata at first. She looked polished, confident, dressed in a way that suggested ease. When our eyes met, there was a flicker of surprise, then recognition. The air between us tightened, heavy with unspoken history. She smiled politely, the kind of smile reserved for acquaintances, not former loves. We exchanged felicities. She asked how I had been, and I answered honestly but vaguely. I didn't mention success. I didn't mention numbers. I didn't mention anything that could tilt the balance of that conversation. I watched her carefully, noticing how she spoke, how she carried herself. She seemed happy, but there was an undercurrent of restlessness I recognized too well. When she asked what I did now, I told her. Her eyebrows lifted just slightly, not enough to be rude, but enough to reveal surprise. She congratulated me, her voice warm, but her eyes searched my face as if trying to reconcile this version of me with the man she once left behind. I felt no urge to impress her. The need had dissolved somewhere along the way. We talked longer than expected, about life, about lessons learned, about how time reshapes priorities. She mentioned a recent breakup, spoke about it lightly, but I could hear the disappointment beneath her words. I listened without judgment. I wasn't there to reopen wounds, mine or hers. As the evening wound down, she looked at me and said, almost casually, "You really turned things around." There was admiration there, and something else too. Regret, perhaps, or curiosity about an alternate timeline where she stayed. I nodded and said that life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. When we parted, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. Seeing her didn't unravel me. It didn't reignite old pain. Instead, it confirmed something I had only recently begun to understand. The man she left and the man standing there were connected, but they were not the same. And neither of us was wrong for choosing what we did with the information we had at the time. That night, driving home in a car I never dreamed of owning, I reflected on how easily bitterness could have shaped my life, how tempting it would have been to measure my success against her absence. But wealth didn't erase the past. It only gave me the space to understand it more clearly. Renata wasn't a villain. She was a mirror, reflecting the harsh truth of a world that values security over promises. I realized then that my story wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about proving to myself that my worth was never tied to my bank balance. Money changed my circumstances, but resilience changed my soul. And that lesson, earned through loss and perseverance, was something no amount of wealth could buy. After that night, I thought Renata would fade back into memory the way old chapters usually do. But life has a strange habit of reopening doors you thought were sealed shut, not to pull you backward, but to test how firmly you're standing now. A few weeks after the charity event, I received a message from her. It was simple. She said it was nice seeing me and asked if I'd like to catch up over coffee sometime. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I was listening carefully to what I felt. What surprised me most was the absence of urgency. Years ago, a message like that would have sent my heart racing, my mind spinning through possibilities. Now it just felt like information. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hopeful. I was curious in a calm, detached way. That alone told me how much I had changed. I agreed to meet her, not because I wanted to revisit what we were, but because I trusted myself enough now to face what we had been without losing balance. We met at a quiet cafe, far nicer than the one where we first crossed paths years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me. This place smelled of polished wood and expensive beans, and neither of us mentioned how far I had come from counting coins in a line just like this. The conversation flowed easily at first, familiar, almost comforting. We talked about work, about books, about how quickly time seems to move once you stop waiting for something to happen. Renata laughed the same way she always had, tilting her head slightly as if leaning into the moment. But beneath the ease there was tension, like a question waiting to be asked. Eventually, she asked it. She said she often wondered what would have happened if she had stayed. Her voice was soft, careful, as if she didn't want to accuse the past of anything. I took a breath before answering, choosing honesty over diplomacy. I told her that I used to ask myself the same thing, but that I had stopped, not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer defined me. She nodded, eyes downcast, stirring her coffee slowly. She admitted that leaving me had been one of the hardest decisions she'd made, but at the time it felt necessary. She was scared of ending up stuck, of waking up one day resenting love for the life it didn't give her. Hearing her say it out loud didn't hurt the way I thought it might. It just sounded like fear, plain and human. I told her something I had never said before, that losing her forced me to confront parts of myself I had been avoiding. That pain became fuel, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted stability on my own terms. I made it clear that my success wasn't born out of proving her wrong. It was born out of finally believing I deserved more than survival. There was a long pause after that. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Maybe it was admiration, maybe regret, maybe both. She said she was proud of me, and I believed her. But pride, I had learned, doesn't always come at the right time to change outcomes. We parted with a hug that felt respectful but final. As I walked away, I felt a strange gratitude for the closure I didn't know I needed. Not every story ends with reunion. Some end with understanding, and that can be just as powerful. In the weeks that followed, I reflected deeply on relationships, on timing, and on the quiet cruelty of growing at different speeds. Renata wasn't wrong to want security. I wasn't wrong to believe in patience. We were just standing on different sides of a bridge neither of us knew how to cross back then. Work continued to demand my attention, but my perspective had shifted. I began mentoring young people at the company, interns who reminded me painfully of my younger self. They were talented, eager, and exhausted. I saw the same quiet fear in their eyes, the fear of never quite catching up. I made a point to listen, to encourage, to pay fairly. Success, I realized, meant little if it didn't ripple outward. One afternoon, as I was leaving the office, I saw a young man sitting alone at his desk long after everyone else had gone. Something about his posture stopped me. I asked if everything was okay. He hesitated, then admitted he was worried about money, about whether pursuing this career was a mistake. I sat down and told him a version of my story, not the glossy parts, but the nights of doubt, the moments of loss. I told him that progress is rarely loud and that resilience often looks like quiet persistence. Driving home that night, I thought about how easily bitterness could have shaped me into someone closed off, defensive, proud in the wrong ways. Instead, pain had softened me. It had taught me empathy, patience, and the importance of dignity. I no longer felt the need to announce where I had been or where I was going. My life spoke for itself now. Months later, I heard through the same grapevine that Renata had moved to another city to start fresh. I wished her well, sincerely. I hoped she found the peace she had been chasing, the kind that doesn't depend entirely on circumstance. I didn't feel the need to reach out. Some connections are meant to rest where they ended. On my birthday that year, I celebrated quietly. A small dinner with close friends, laughter without excess, gratitude without performance. As I looked around the table, I realized that wealth had given me comfort, but clarity had given me contentment. The boy who once equated love with sacrifice had grown into a man who understood balance. Late that night, alone with my thoughts, I acknowledged something important. Renata leaving wasn't the worst thing that happened to me. It was the catalyst. It forced me to confront reality, to take responsibility for my future, and to stop waiting for someone else to validate my worth. In that sense, her absence had shaped my presence. Life doesn't always reward loyalty in the way we expect. Sometimes it rewards growth, quietly, patiently, waiting for us to be ready. And when it does, the victory isn't loud. It's steady. It's peaceful. It feels like standing firmly in your own skin. As my life settled into a steady rhythm, I began to notice how differently I moved through the world, not with arrogance, not with fear, but with a quiet assurance that surprised even me. Success didn't announce itself with fireworks. It arrived gently in the form of choices. I could say no without panic. I could rest without guilt. I could walk away from situations that drained me, knowing survival no longer depended on tolerance alone. That was when I met Clara. She wasn't someone who entered my life with intensity or expectation. We met through a mutual friend at a small dinner gathering, the kind where a conversation flows easily because no one is trying too hard. Clara listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was thoughtful, measured. She asked questions that weren't about what I did or what I owned, but about what I believed. That alone disarmed me. I didn't tell her my full story at first, not because I was hiding it, but because I no longer felt the need to lead with it. We took things slowly, walks, conversations, shared silences. She knew I worked a lot, and she respected it without glorifying it. When she talked about her own life, her ambitions were grounded, rooted in purpose rather than appearance. Being around her felt easy, like exhaling after holding your breath for too long. At some point, the subject of past relationships came up. I told her about Renata, not with bitterness, but with honesty. I spoke about love, loss, and the lessons that followed. Clara didn't interrupt, she didn't judge, she simply listened. And when I finished, she said something that stayed with me. She said people leave when they're afraid of the future they see, and that doesn't always make them cruel. Sometimes it just makes them human. That perspective didn't excuse pain, but it contextualized it. With Clara, I realized how much emotional maturity matters, how love doesn't have to feel like proving something, it can feel like alignment. As our connection deepened, I noticed how differently I showed up. I was present, I was open, I wasn't trying to be impressive, I wasn't shrinking either. I allowed myself to be known, flaws and all. When I shared my worries, she didn't dismiss them or magnify them, she met them where they were. Work continued to grow, bringing new challenges and responsibilities. I was offered opportunities that would have once intimidated me beyond reason. Now I approached them with curiosity instead of fear. Failure no longer felt like a verdict, it felt like information. That shift changed everything. One afternoon, I received an invitation to speak at a small industry conference. Standing backstage, waiting to be called, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not fear, but remembrance. I thought about the version of myself who would have never imagined standing there. When I spoke, I didn't focus on success metrics or strategies. I spoke about resilience, about the invisible years, about how quickly people judge outcomes without understanding the starting point. The response was quieter than applause. It was connection. People approached me afterward with stories in their eyes, recognition in their voices. That night, Clara held my hand as we walked back to the hotel. She said she was proud of me, and it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like partnership. I realized then how different it is to be loved by someone who isn't trying to extract something from your future, but willing to walk alongside you as it unfolds. Not everything was perfect. We disagreed sometimes. We had moments of misunderstanding, but the difference was how we handled them. No ultimatums, no silent resentment, just conversation, patience, and a shared desire to understand rather than win. Around that time, my parents came to visit. They had watched my life from a distance, worrying quietly, celebrating privately. Seeing them in my home, comfortable and at ease, filled me with a deep, steady gratitude. My mother looked around and said she was proud, not of what I had achieved, but of who I had become. That distinction mattered more than anything. One evening, as we sat together, my father asked about Renata, not out of curiosity, but out of concern. I told him the truth, that I had loved her, that she left, that I didn't hate her for it anymore. He nodded slowly and said something simple. He said sometimes people are chapters, not endings, and if you try to force them to be endings, you miss the rest of the book. That stayed with me. Life has a way of circling back on itself, not to repeat, but to remind. A year after our coffee meeting, Renata reached out once more. She had heard about my talk, seen a clip online. She congratulated me again, and this time there was no hesitation in her words, just sincerity. I thanked her, wished her well, and that was all. There was no pull, no unresolved tension, just two people acknowledging a shared past from a healthy distance. With Clara, the future felt steady, not rushed, not forced. We talked about long-term plans with openness, not pressure, about building something together that wasn't defined by fear of loss or obsession with status. Love, I was learning, doesn't demand proof, it offers presence. On a quiet Sunday morning, sitting on the balcony with a cup of coffee, I reflected on how far I had come. The man who was once left behind because he was poor had become someone rich in ways that couldn't be measured on a balance sheet. Perspective, patience, peace. These were the things that stayed when the noise faded. Money had changed my options, but time and experience had changed my heart. I no longer blamed Renata for choosing differently. I no longer blamed myself for not being enough back then. We were both doing the best we could with what we understood at the time. The real victory wasn't becoming a millionaire. It was becoming someone who could hold his past gently without letting it harden him or define him. And as I watched the city wake up below, I knew that whatever came next, I was finally living from a place of wholeness, not lack. As the years unfolded, I began to understand that stability has a sound. It's quiet. It doesn't announce itself or demand attention. It's the absence of panic when something unexpected happens. It's the ability to sit with uncertainty without feeling like the ground is about to disappear beneath your feet. For most of my life, I had lived without that sound, always bracing, always preparing for impact. Now, it surrounded me like a low, steady hum. Clara and I moved in together slowly, thoughtfully. We didn't rush to fill the space with furniture or declarations. We let the apartment grow into us the way relationships should. Some evenings we talked for hours. Others we sat side by side in comfortable silence, each doing our own thing, checking in with a glance or a smile. That balance felt like trust in its purest form. One night, over a simple dinner, she asked me something that caught me off guard. She asked if I ever worried that she might leave the way Renata did. The question wasn't accusatory, it was curious, gentle. I didn't answer right away. I thought about the old fear that used to live in my chest, the fear that love was conditional, temporary, fragile. Then I realized that fear had softened. It hadn't disappeared completely, but it no longer ruled me. I told her the truth, that once I had believed love was something you earned by becoming more successful, more secure, more impressive. Losing Renata had cemented that belief for a long time, but now I understood that real love doesn't keep score. It grows in environments where both people feel safe enough to be honest about who they are and where they're going. Clara reached across the table and squeezed my hand, not promising forever, but offering presence. That was enough. Professionally, I found myself increasingly drawn to purpose-driven work. Wealth had given me options, and with those options came responsibility. I invested in small businesses, particularly those started by people who reminded me of my younger self, people with ideas but no safety net. I didn't just write checks. I mentored. I listened. I tried to be the kind of support I once needed but didn't have. Not every investment succeeded. Some failed spectacularly. But failure didn't frighten me the way it once had. I'd learned that loss doesn't erase value. It refines it. Each experience added texture to my understanding of success, stripping it of ego and replacing it with perspective. Around that time, I was invited to speak at a community center not far from the neighborhood where I grew up. Walking into that room stirred something deep in me. The walls were plain, the chairs mismatched, but the faces were familiar in a way that transcended time. I spoke to them not as a success story, but as someone who had once sat exactly where they were, wondering if effort would ever be enough. After the talk, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She said her boyfriend had recently left her because she was struggling financially, and she felt ashamed, small, disposable. I recognized that pain immediately. I told her that loss doesn't define worth, that sometimes rejection is a redirection we don't understand until much later. I watched something shift in her expression, not relief, but resolve. Moments like that mattered more to me than any financial milestone. That night, driving home, I thought about Renata again, not with longing, but with understanding. Her decision had hurt deeply, but it had also exposed a truth I couldn't ignore, that I needed to build a life rooted in self-respect, not validation. In a strange way, her leaving had been both a wound and a gift. Clara noticed when I was quieter than usual. She always did. When I told her about the talk and the young woman, she listened intently. Then she said something simple but profound. She said that people come into our lives to wake us up to something. Some wake us up through love, others through loss. Both are teachers. I realized then how grateful I was to be with someone who saw complexity instead of categories. As our relationship deepened, the topic of marriage eventually surfaced, not as a proposal, but as a conversation. We talked about what commitment meant to us, about fears and expectations. I admitted that part of me still carried the echo of being left, the worry that circumstances could shift and love could follow. Clara didn't dismiss that fear. She acknowledged it, and then she reminded me that choosing someone always carries risk. The difference now was that I wasn't choosing from a place of fear, but from clarity. We decided not to rush, to let commitment be something that grew naturally from shared values rather than timelines. That decision felt right, grounded. For the first time, I wasn't trying to secure love by locking it into a future plan. I was allowing it to exist fully in the present. One evening, sorting through old boxes, I came across items from my past life. Old pay stubs, rejection letters, a notebook filled with ideas I once thought would save me. Holding those things, I felt a wave of emotion I hadn't expected. Not sadness, gratitude. That version of me had endured so much without knowing where it would lead. He had kept going anyway. I kept one item from that box, a small note I had written to myself years ago during one of my lowest moments. It said, "Don't let this be the end." There is a moment in life when you realize you're no longer reacting to the world, but responding to it. For me, that realization came quietly, without ceremony, on an ordinary weekday morning. I was reviewing proposals at my desk, sunlight spilling across the room, when I noticed my hands were steady, No rushing heartbeat, no tight chest. Just focus, calm, control. It struck me then how far I had traveled emotionally, not just financially. Clara and I had settled into a rhythm that felt both grounding and expansive. We supported each other's ambitions without competing, celebrated wins without comparison. She challenged me in ways that mattered, pushing me to articulate my values, not just my goals. With her, success wasn't a performance, it was a shared experience. Around that time, I was invited to join the foundation focused on economic mobility. Accepting the role felt like closing a circle I hadn't known was open. The work brought me face to face with stories that echoed my own, people caught in cycles of effort and limitation. I listened carefully, remembering how invisible I once felt, how desperately I wanted someone to see potential instead of circumstance. During one board meeting, a proposal came up about funding programs for adults who had been left behind by traditional systems. As others debated budgets and metrics, I found myself speaking from memory instead of theory. I talked about dignity, about how poverty erodes not just opportunity, but identity. The room grew quiet. For the first time, I wasn't the man trying to escape his past. I was the man using it. That shift affected how I viewed Renata's place in my story. I no longer framed her as the catalyst, the turning point, or the symbol of what I lost. She became part of a larger narrative, one thread among many. Her choice hadn't created my resilience, it had revealed it. Life tested that understanding when I unexpectedly ran into her again. This time it was at an airport lounge. We recognized each other instantly, that familiar moment of surprise followed by acceptance. We sat together, time to spare, conversation unfolding naturally. She told me about her new job, the city she now called home. I told her about my work with the foundation. There was no tension, no measuring, just two people sharing updates. At one point, she looked at me thoughtfully and said she sometimes wondered if she had left too soon. The question hung between us, heavy but honest. I didn't rush to answer. I told her that timing shapes outcomes in ways we can't always predict, that who we are at one stage of life isn't always equipped for what comes next. She nodded, absorbing that. Before we parted, she said she was genuinely happy for me. I believed her, and for the first time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Compassion. Not pity, not superiority, just compassion for two younger people who had been trying to survive with limited tools. When I returned home, I told Clara about the encounter. Transparency mattered to us. She listened without defensiveness, without insecurity. She asked how I felt. I searched inward and realized the answer surprised me. I felt complete. Not because the past had resolved itself neatly, but because it no longer had power over my present. That completeness showed up in small ways. I slept better. I laughed more freely. I approached challenges with curiosity instead of dread. Even setbacks felt manageable, framed by the knowledge that I had navigated worse and emerged stronger. One afternoon, while reviewing scholarship applications for the foundation, I read an essay that stopped me cold. A young man wrote about being left by his partner because he couldn't provide financial stability. He wrote about feeling invisible, ashamed, lost. The words felt like an echo across time. I advocated strongly for his application, not out of sympathy, but recognition. I wanted him to have the chance I had carved out through years of struggle. As the Foundation's programs expanded, so did my sense of purpose. I began to understand that wealth, when hoarded, shrinks the soul. When shared intentionally, it expands it. Giving wasn't about obligation, it was about alignment with the person I had become. Clara and I took a trip together, nothing extravagant, just time away from routine. One evening, sitting by the water, Clara asked me what success meant to me now. I thought about it carefully. I told her success meant waking up without fear. It meant choosing relationships that felt honest. It meant contributing to something larger than myself without losing myself in the process. She smiled and said that sounded like peace, and she was right. As the years continued, I found myself telling my story less often, not because it wasn't important, but because it had settled into me. It no longer demanded retelling to make sense. It simply informed my choices, quietly guiding me. Renata became someone I thought of occasionally, kindly, without longing, a chapter that had taught me about boundaries, ambition, and the cost of misaligned timing. I hoped she found fulfillment on her terms. I no longer needed to know. The man who once equated being left with being unworthy had learned a deeper truth. Worth isn't proven by who stays when you're struggling. It's revealed by who you become when you're alone. That realization anchored me in a way nothing else ever had. Standing in my office one evening, city lights flickering on as dusk settled, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Not for the money, though it had eased many burdens, but for the journey that it shaped me, tested me, refined me. For the losses that forced me to grow, for the love that taught me how to stay. Life had not unfolded the way I imagined when I was younger. It unfolded better, not because it was easier, but because I was ready to meet it fully. And that, more than anything, felt like the truest form of success. There's a quiet moment that comes after growth, after healing, after you've told your story enough times that it no longer trembles when you speak it. That moment arrived for me one evening when I was alone in my office long after everyone had gone home. The city below glowed softly, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about what I still needed to prove. I was thinking about what I needed to protect. Clara and I had been together long enough now that our bond had moved past excitement and into intention. Love had settled into something sturdier. We had weathered stress, distance, and uncertainty together, not because life had tested us harshly, but because we were honest enough to test ourselves before life did it for us. That honesty had become the foundation of everything. One night, she asked me a question that carried weight, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. She asked if I ever feared that success might change me in ways I wouldn't notice until it was too late. I thought about it carefully. I thought about the men I'd met who had lost themselves chasing numbers, validation, power. I thought about how easily gratitude can erode into entitlement. I told her the truth, that yes, I feared it sometimes, but I also feared becoming the man I once was again, not because he was weak, but because he didn't yet know his value. I said the key difference now was awareness. I wasn't running from poverty anymore, and I wasn't chasing approval. I was choosing alignment. And as long as I kept choosing that, I believed I'd be okay. That conversation marked a shift, not outwardly, but inwardly. I began making decisions with longevity in mind, not just growth. I stepped back from projects that demanded too much at the cost of my peace. I delegated more. I trusted others. Control, I learned, is often just fear wearing confidence. Around this time, the foundation reached a milestone. One of our early scholarship recipients launched a small business that began hiring locally. Watching that ripple effect unfold filled me with a satisfaction I had never found in personal achievement alone. It felt like legacy, not in the sense of being remembered, but in the sense of leaving things better than I found them. At a community event celebrating the foundation's anniversary, I was asked to speak again. This time, I spoke less about struggle and more about dignity, about how being poor had once stripped me of dignity in the eyes of others, but how reclaiming it had been an inside job. I talked about how easy it is to confuse worth with utility and how dangerous that confusion can be. As I spoke, I saw faces nodding, eyes glistening. People weren't listening because I was successful, they were listening because I was honest. After the event, someone approached me quietly, a woman in her 40s, well-dressed but tired around the eyes. She introduced herself as Renata's older cousin. My heart skipped for just a second, more out of surprise than emotion. She told me Renata had mentioned me recently, not with regret, but with reflection. She said Renata often spoke about how leaving me had taught her something important about herself, that chasing security without emotional alignment had its own cost. Hearing that didn't inflate me, it humbled me. It reminded me that we all carry our lessons differently and that growth isn't always visible from the outside. I thanked her and wished Renata well. When the conversation ended, I felt no urge to reach out, no unresolved pull, just quiet acceptance. That night, I shared the encounter with Clara. She listened, then asked if I felt closure. I realized something in that moment. Closure hadn't come from conversations or explanations. It had come from becoming someone who no longer needed answers from the past to stand firmly in the present. Weeks later, Clara and I took a long walk through a neighborhood we both loved. At some point, we stopped near a small park, the kind with old trees and worn benches. She turned to me and said she felt ready to talk about the future in a more concrete way. Not as a demand, not as a test, as an invitation. I didn't respond immediately. I felt the weight of the moment, the echo of who I had once been, the man who had been left because he couldn't provide, the man who once believed love was something you earned only after success. And then I felt the man I had become, grounded, present, clear. I told her I was ready too, ready not because everything was perfect, but because I finally understood what commitment actually meant. Not security through money, but security through consistency, respect, and shared values. She smiled, tears in her eyes, and for the first time, the future didn't feel like a distant idea, it felt like a shared direction. Later that evening, alone with my thoughts, I reflected on the arc of my life. How Renata leaving had once shattered me, how becoming a millionaire had once seemed like the answer to everything, and how neither of those moments defined me as much as the choices I made quietly, repeatedly, over time. I understood then that the story wasn't about her leaving because I was poor. It was about what I did with the space her absence created. I could have filled it with bitterness. I could have filled it with ego. Instead, I filled it with growth, patience, and purpose. There was a time when I imagined seeing Renata again and feeling triumphant, validated, proven. But standing where I was now, I realized how small that version of victory would have been. Real victory was not needing that moment at all. As I turned off the lights that night, preparing to go home to a life I had built intentionally, I felt something settle deep inside me. Gratitude. Not just for what I had gained, but for what I had survived without letting it define me. My story was no longer about being left. It was about staying true to myself, staying open to growth, staying kind even when the world taught me to harden. And I knew with quiet certainty that the final chapter of this journey wasn't about wealth or romance or recognition. It was about dignity. The night Clara and I officially decided to move forward together didn't come with fireworks or grand announcements. It came with a quiet understanding, the kind that settles into your bones and tells you this choice will hold. We didn't rush to define everything all at once. We talked about values, about how we wanted to handle conflict, about the kind of life we hoped to build when no one else was watching. Commitment, I had learned, wasn't a single moment. It was a series of small, intentional decisions made over time. As we planned our future, I noticed how different this felt from the dreams Renata and I once shared. Back then, Everything had been about escape, escaping struggle, escaping limitation, escaping fear. Now the focus was on presence, on creating a life that felt steady, honest, and rooted. The shift was subtle, but it changed everything. I continued my work with the foundation, traveling occasionally to see the programs firsthand. In one city, I met a group of adults who had returned to school after years of working low-wage jobs. They spoke about exhaustion, about doubt, about the quiet shame of starting late. I listened and told them that starting late is still starting and that resilience doesn't have an expiration date. When I left that room, I felt lighter than I had after any business deal I'd ever closed. Clara and I eventually decided to host a small gathering to celebrate the life we were building. Friends, family, people who had witnessed different chapters of our journey. My parents were there, their pride no longer cautious but open. As I looked around the room, I realized how many versions of myself were represented there. The struggling son, the determined young man, the cautious success story, and now the partner, the mentor, the man at peace. At one point during the evening, my mother pulled me aside. She said something I hadn't expected. She said she used to worry that losing Renata would harden me, that disappointment would turn into bitterness. Instead, she watched me grow kinder, more patient, more grounded. She said that was the kind of wealth that lasts. I held on to her words, knowing how easily things could have gone another way. Later that night, as the guests began to leave, Clara and I sat together, exhausted and content. She asked me if I ever wished things had happened differently, if part of me still wondered what life would have looked like if Renata had stayed. I thought carefully before answering. I told her that wondering isn't the same as wishing. Curiosity about alternate paths doesn't mean regret. It just means acknowledging that every choice closes some doors while opening others. The truth was, if Renata had stayed, I might never have faced myself so honestly. I might have settled for survival disguised as stability. I might have mistaken endurance for fulfillment. Her leaving had forced me to confront my fears, my limitations, and my potential. It had hurt deeply, but it had also pushed me forward in ways comfort never could. Months later, I received a handwritten letter in the mail. It was from Renata. I hadn't expected it, and I didn't know how to feel at first. The letter wasn't long. She wrote about reflection, about how life had taught her that security without emotional alignment feels empty. She wrote that seeing my journey from a distance had helped her understand that leaving wasn't wrong, but that it came with lessons she was still learning. She wished me happiness, genuinely. I read the letter twice, then placed it carefully in a drawer. I didn't feel the need to respond. Not out of indifference, but out of completion. Some conversations don't need continuation. They need respect. That night, I told Clara about the letter. She listened, then asked how I felt. I searched for the answer and found it quickly. I felt grateful. Grateful for the love that had been. Grateful for the pain that shaped me. Grateful for the clarity that followed. The past no longer asked anything of me. It simply existed, acknowledged, and integrated. As time moved on, Clara and I made our commitment official in a small, meaningful ceremony surrounded by those who mattered most. There were no extravagant displays, no performances, just vows rooted in honesty, respect, and shared growth. Standing there, I thought briefly of the man I used to be, the one who believed he wasn't enough because his bank account said so. I wish I could tell him that worth isn't measured by what you can give someone materially, but by how you show up emotionally, consistently, and truthfully. Our life together wasn't perfect, but it was real. We faced challenges with openness, disagreements with respect. Money was no longer a source of fear or identity. It was simply a tool, one we used thoughtfully. The real richness of our life came from trust, from laughter, from the knowledge that we were choosing each other without conditions.